This lesson is extra practice with suffixes. In the previous lesson, we learned the difference between prefixes, root words, and suffixes. So what you should remember from that lesson is that you can start with a root word and add meaning to it by adding a prefix to the beginning or a suffix to the end. So today, we're going to talk more about suffixes. So here's a list of some suffixes or endings that we could add onto the end of different root words. I don't want to read out this whole list, so I'll just mention a couple that are pretty common. You might add ed onto the end, or ing, or ly, or ful. Those are some of the common suffixes. So to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about, let's start out with the root word help and add some different suffixes to it. Alright, so if we started with help and we added ed onto the end, we'd end up with helped, H-E-L-P-E-D. So here we've got a past tense verb, and in a sentence, we could use it in a sentence. She helped wrap the gifts. Next example, we could add ing to the end. We could have helping, H-E-L-P-I-N-G. Now there's two things that could happen when we add ing. The first is that we could end up with something called a participle. The second is that we could end up with an adjective. Now you won't always get an adjective, just sometimes, and it does work if we add ing to the word help. Let me show you what I mean. First of all, let's look at the participle option. Right? We could have a present participle, or we could have a past participle. So a present participle would be something that's happening now, and a past participle would be something that happened before in the past. And again, we're using the root word help and we're adding ing to the end. So in the present, she is helping. In the past, she was helping. Now I mentioned using helping as an adjective. Well, here's an example of what I mean. I need a helping hand. Helping hand. It's a type of hand, a helping hand. Alright, next suffix, next ending onto our root word help. We could add er, and we could end up with helper. So now you can imagine we have a person, we have a helper, right? Now that's another type of noun. Help is a noun too, it's a thing, but here we have a different type of noun. So we've changed the meaning a little bit, right? We still have a noun, but we have a person. Here's the word helper in a sentence. A good helper is hard to find. Helpful. If we add ful, we end up with H-E-L-P, F-U-L, helpful, and we get an adjective. In a sentence, they weren't very helpful. Last example. Now in this example, you might notice it or you might not, but I've actually added two suffixes. I've added ful and ly onto the end. And what I end up with is the word helpfully, H-E-L-P-F-U-L-L-Y. And helpfully is an adverb. In a sentence, it was cold, so he helpfully made tea. Some of you might be saying, well, what's the difference between an adjective and an adverb? Well, if we look at the sentence above here, they weren't very helpful. we're talking about them. We're talking about some people. We don't know who they are. It doesn't matter. But we're describing them. And we're saying that they weren't helpful. And helpful is an adjective. But down here, when we use helpfully, he helpfully made tea. Helpfully made tea. That is how he made the tea. Helpfully made it. That's the action that he was doing and how he did that action. So adverbs go with actions and adjectives describe people, places, or things. So as you can imagine, there are so many different suffixes that there's no way I could explain them all. And what I will talk about next is how sometimes when you add an ending, you have to change the root word a little bit. So I just want to focus on the suffixes ed and ing. So as I said, here, number one, you might not need to change the root word at all. So I've got two root words as examples here. The root word respect and the root word pick. So if we start with respect here and we add ed, we end up with respected. If we add ing, we end up with respecting. And with the word pick, if we add ed, we end up with picked. And if we add ing, we end up with the word picking. In both of these cases, you notice that all we had to do was either add ed or add ing. We didn't have to change how the root word was spelled at all, right? Just look at respected, right? R-E-S-P-E-C-T. We just added ed to get R-E-S-P-E-C-T-E-D. Now, number two, you might need to drop an e before adding the suffix. In other words, you're not going to have two e's in a row, right? Let's look at some examples here. We've got the root word time, T-I-M-E. Well, before we can add ed or ing, we need to drop the e. So you can imagine that you're crossing it off, which is what I've done here on the left. So that when we write out the new words, right, let's say we write out the word timed, we end up with T-I-M-E-D. You notice there's only one E before the D. And when we write out the word timing, we end up with T-I-M-I-N-G. And you notice we dropped that E, right? So there's no E there at all. Or we look at the word create, right? So we'd first of all drop the E. So we imagine that we're crossing it off, and then we'd add ed to that. And we'd get created, C-R-E-A-T-E-D. Or we could add ing instead of ed, and we would still drop that e. So because our suffix is ing, we're going to end up with no e before that I, right? Because we're dropping it. So we end up with creating, C-R-E-A-T-I-N-G. So a quick reminder here. Notice when we drop an e, we do not have two e's in a row. Now, another thing to remember is to be careful if you see a root word that ends in the letter Y. Alright, so let's look at a few different words. And essentially what you need to know is that if you have a consonant and a Y, then you need to make a change. But if you have a vowel and a Y, then you do not need to make any change. So a consonant and a Y would be a root word like deny, D-E-N-Y, right? It ends in N-Y. N is a consonant, and of course Y is at the end. So when we have a consonant and a Y at the end of the root word, what we need to do is change the Y to an I before we add the suffix. Okay. So we go from deny, the root word deny, D-E-N-Y, and then we could add ed, and we'd end up with denied, D-E-N-I-E-D. Notice how we've changed that Y to an I. Right. Now, if we're adding ing, something that's good to know is that we don't have to change it at all. We just add ing. So we end up with denying, D-E-N-Y-I-N-G. Right? So if we have a consonant and a Y and we're adding ed, then we need to change the Y to an I. But we don't have to do anything if we're adding ing. Another place where we would not need to make any change is if we had a root word that had a vowel and then a Y. So maybe something like the root word play, P-L-A-Y. We could end up with played, we could add ed, P-L-A-Y-E-D, or we could end up with playing, P-L-A-Y-I-N-G. Right? So look out for places where you might have to change the Y to an I, like we have here with denied when we've added ed, D-E-N-I-E-D. So what have we been talking about? Just a reminder, we're talking about starting with a root word and adding an ending onto that root word. Right? Some more examples of this. You could change the root word shock by adding different suffixes. Right? We could add different endings. So we start off with shock, we could add ed and get shocked, S-H-O-C-K-E-D. Or we could add ing and get shocking, S-H-O-C-K-I-N-G. Another example, you might change the root word gather. So we'd go from gather to either gathered, G-A-T-H-E-R-E-D, or gathering, G-A-T-H-E-R-I-N-G. Or, it's important to know that you could also do the opposite. So, if you do something called dropping a suffix, when you drop a suffix, you end up making a root word. So you could start off with a word that actually has a suffix on it, and you might need to write the root word. So for example, you can drop the ed from the words worked and purchased. Right? So the instructions here would be write the root word of the following. So you'd get worked and you'd have to drop the ed. You'd have to drop the suffix and you'd get work. Or you'd start off with purchased and you'd end up with purchase. Be careful here. Notice the word purchase is spelled P-U-R-C-H-A-S-E. So the root word purchase has an E at the end, and that will happen sometimes. So make sure that you're spelling your root words correctly. You might also drop the ing from the words too, right? So maybe you start off with hoping and running. So hoping, you'd end up with hope, H-O-P-E. Or running, you would end up with run, R-U-N. And hope is another example of a root word that ends in E. So just to finish off with a few more quick examples, of writing the root word. So we could start with folded, F-O-L-D-E-D, and end up with the root word fold. So that's the word without a suffix, right? That's what the root word is, F-O-L-D. Or we could start off with purchasing and end up with purchase, I mentioned purchase already, right? P-U-R-C-H-A-S-E. Or you could start off with hoped, H-O-P-E-D, and get hope, H-O-P-E. And I also mentioned hope already. So the root word is the word without the ending. In all of these examples here above, I either took off the ed at the end or the ing at the end. Well, I hope these notes have been helpful, and I look forward to next time.